Hi, I'm Manu. Matt actually introduced my talk quite nicely in his last couple of comments. I've been doing games, AAA games, and with a major focus on the super portability for a long, long time. So I'm stuck in C land. I know a lot of people have sort of moved off. They found C#, they found JavaScript, they found all these other little environments. My issue with these things has always been they're really niche. You know, you'll end up in this little niche box over here and you're stuck in that universe, and I really care about porting my stuff to everywhere imaginable. And even if you are in these niche universes with Python or whatever, it always sort of finds its way back to C in the end anyway, I think. You know, you'll want to do something fast, and then you'll have to implement that little bit in C code and then do some sort of language binding for Python or C# or whatever. I like native languages. I'm still on them. I'm stuck with them. And that's that. The problem is C and C++ are crap. We all hate them, I think. I certainly do. And then one day, what happened? No, that didn't work.
Is there a play button on that remote?
Yeah, there is. But now it's gone like that.
Maybe also click allow the full screen.
Hooray. I found D. It was this guy's fault. D's open source. It's an open source community. If you want to get involved, then go and get involved. Why is it cool? Why should you check it out? Well, first, who's who? This guy here, Walter Bright. He's a cool dude. He wrote the first C++ compiler, the Zortex C++, very long time ago. He knows like an awful lot about programming languages. And it's endorsed by this fella here, Andrei Alexandrescu, who wrote like a bunch of books that most people have on their desks, if you're in the C world. So I'm going to try and sell D to you. And it's very nice with things like Emscripten now. So even if you're worried about these sort of modern sandboxed environments, worried about the web and things like that, you can use native languages with Emscripten or NACL and still work in those environments. But you'll still have your native code, which will run really fast and portably on many small devices, games consoles, phones. You don't need to compromise these days. So what's good about D? Yep, it looks and feels more or less like C++ or C# or Java. You know, we're all familiar with these languages.
Is that a plus or a minus?
Hey?
Is that a plus or a minus?
Well, do you like C#?
Yeah, somewhat. The closer it gets to JavaScript, the better.
The closer it gets to JavaScript, the better.
Right.
Okay.
With the bar keyword and the dynamic offense.
So I think a good tagline for D off the bat is sort of C++ done right. I'm not going to say it's exactly like any of these because it's obviously something a bit different, but it feels familiar to any developer in any of those languages. It's probably more like C# than any with C++ tendencies and Java tendencies, but it's got things like the auto keyword, which will automatically type things. It's a strongly typed language, so that's important. But yeah, I think no significant time investment required to retrain your workforce is an important factor. I like it. It has a fairly advanced ecosystem these days. There are 3 compilers. There is the reference compiler, which is the one that everyone works on. And that's, as Matt alluded to, sort of like the compiler front end, which gets bolted on to GCC and LLVM, which is a very popular backend these days. And the LLVM compiler can target Emscripten, NACL, all those things. So in terms of target architectures, D will get you practically everywhere that C will get you now. There's good development environments. There's Visual Studio if you're into that. There's MonoDevelop if you're into that. There's Eclipse if you're into that. Kdevelop's had some work. There's people that use some other stuff too. But hey, that's good. There's stuff there. Standard library is useful, but there's still some holes. There's lots of community libraries that plug the holes, so you kind of get more or less the library experience that you expect from C++. Probably actually something approaching C#, but not quite there in terms of comprehensive stuff yet. People currently use it for sort of short, like apps, like system processors and stuff, services. There's a big movement using it for web services. A lot of web services actually use D as their language. So instead of using Java or some other non-native thing, people are writing native web services. Works well. Real-time in games is an actively emerging interest, and I'm sort of a big driving force for that in the community. There's also windowing toolkits available if you like doing, apps to sort of compete with C#. There's the Win32 stuff directly. You've got Qt and GDK bindings, but they're less thorough. What's good about it is it's modern. Unlike C and C++, you can expect like all the features that you expect from modern languages. So like, it's got proper reflection. It's got garbage collection, which people expect these days. You kind of want that. And in fact, I think that's one of the major inhibitors for... Let me get to that in the comments. I think that's an inhibitor though.
See my face, I was about to jump.
Yeah. No, I think garbage collection is important. If you're writing something that's not like a game, if you just want to write an app, no, the thing that pisses me off is when you've got to use like 4 different languages for 4 different tasks, and I've created like a little library over here that I want to use in this thing over here. It really annoys me when you've got all this code in all these different worlds and it's difficult to marry them. You have to have a garbage collector these days, and so many programmers won't work without one. Now, D makes a garbage collector optional. I can talk about that at length, but I won't. It does have a garbage collector. You can use it.
As a very quick aside, I believe Apple originally were going garbage collection. Then with Objective-C, they moved to
reference counting.
And I believe Swift is the same.
Yeah.
So.
Uses Arc. I've been, that's a long conversation.
Still a lot of secular references, perhaps.
D could use Arc. It just doesn't right now. It's a library. The garbage collector is a library, so it's not even like the language has some things that make implicit calls into the garbage collector library, but it is still a library, and you can implement your own. You can pull it out and plug in a different one if you want to. It's got things like attributes, how you can attribute in C# and Java and sort of just tag declarations anywhere. It's got functional programming stuff. It's got some of the best bits from Haskell. It's got pure, it's got immutable and all those nice things. So you can do some really precise, proofably correct code. There's obviously for each and like strings. Oh my God, strings. C doesn't have strings, like not really. Everything else you'd expect. It's got some novel stuff too. It's got this thing called compile time functional evaluation. So you can actually run D code at compile time to produce results that can be used at compile time. Kind of novel for a native, fully compiled language.
That's eval.
Hey?
Eval, like evaluate arbitrary.
Yeah. So any D code, almost any D code, will execute at compile time. So you can actually sort of execute D code and then assign the result to an enum, which is just a compile time value.
Including
for instance.
importing modules, stuff like.
Yep.
What's the method name for that one?
Well, it's not a method name. You just do it. Like if you assign some runtime code to an enum is a fixed, compile time value. If you just assign something to an enum, then it will run it at compile time because it has to.
It's not like eval in JavaScript.
No.
There's some confusion there.
Well, I don't know JavaScript very well.
Sound like that anyway.
Well, it's in Python and Ruby and any sort of interpreted language where you can, and now with the Roslyn compiler in C# you can execute code.
But they're dynamic languages anyway. Can't you execute code?
More like the, I can't think of the name for D, but the catch-all dangerous thing that Walter added. That lets you.
Yeah, mix-ins.
Yeah, mixin. Eval's like a mixin.
Okay. So you can write code in a string and then run it.
So you're talking about
D can do that.
code at compile time. He's talking about running code or compiling code at runtime.
Compiling code at runtime.
It's the opposite of what you're saying.
So basically all the crap people do with template metaprogramming, except actually giving you a proper language to do it instead of all that.
A proper language to do it instead. So yeah, that's like one of my biggest beefs with C++ is that templates are just a broken separate universe. D will sort of nicely marry those universes together. It'll be the same language. You'll get the same syntax, the same flow. I'll get back to some things at the end depending on how much time I've got. I can go into like more depth on things that people are interested about. Yeah?
5 minutes.
5 minutes,
Continue the talk at the top.
Okay. There's got this concept of a scope statement, which will say, it's useful for error handling in particular. Who's ever written that piece of code where you go allocate something and then try and allocate this other thing, and then if that thing failed, then unallocate that thing before returning, and then try this one, and if that one failed, then you've got to unallocate that one and the one from back, you know that process? Everyone's hit that. You can sort of tag things with scope exit or scope fail, and it'll get back to that at the end of the function, or it'll execute those things in reverse order on failure. So if you're running through a function and something fails, and you can say, well, I allocated this thing, and you can say scope fail, deallocate this thing.
Isn't that just the finally part of a try-catch?
Yeah, but have you surely, well, you know when functions do this a couple of times and that try-catch block becomes 10 levels deep.
So it's like
Otherwise you use smart pointers which can clean themselves up.
Yeah, but that assumes the program is in kind of a runnable state. Depends what the failure was, you know, how bad was the crash.
That is the problem area.
Danny.
That's where you see go-tos in the occasional program.
You see go-tos. That's where go-tos always pop up. It's got this other one called slices, which lets you sort of subdivide ranges and arrays, which is very nice and difficult to describe in 2 words, so I won't. One of its important things is it's safe and correct. Unlike C, D really tries to make a commitment to actual language sort of properness, correctness, and memory safety. So memory safety is a focus. But by default, it shouldn't compromise performance. The type system will try to be as safe as possible, like really modern safety features. Some of them are fairly novel. But in addition to that, it has this @safe attribute. So you can attribute things @safe, and then the compiler will absolutely assert that you do not do anything that could possibly ruin the state of the program. So you can't access raw pointers, for instance, in @safe code. You can't. It'll proof that you can't corrupt memory.
Isn't that kind of back to front? Shouldn't the safe version do that?
A lot of people argued that. The problem was that D didn't have that originally, and it was added. And then you'd break the history of D if you change that to be the default.
There's system.
Yeah, but I won't bother discussing that in detail. But that's very handy. So, you know, there's a lot of people that do, like, you know, the university guys that want to do like numerical stuff and they want precision. They don't really care as much about performance. They just want to know their program works. And there's like a whole field for that. You know, there's what's the language that people use? The one that the Ariane rocket blew up. ADA, yeah, ADA is all about that. You know, they're all about, you know, defining numeric ranges and trying to proofably safify your code. But I don't know. D does a pretty interesting effort at that. D has built-in unit tests. So you just sort of attribute unit tests all over your code. It encourages you to use unit tests. I find myself not using unit tests because I'm lazy and it's hard to make unit tests, but D makes it easy. It's got a comprehensive set of contracts, preconditions, invariants, and all the other little good stuff that'll try and prove that your code is correct all the time. I hate bugs. I'm sick of chasing bugs, especially as a C programmer. You know, I think that's one of the things that scares people away from C. And D makes great efforts in thread safety. So static variables, like globally accessible stuff, it's thread local by default, so that eliminates a whole, you know, race conditions and things like that. They're time consuming, you know, threading related bugs are always time consuming, so we try to make those go away. It's lightning fast to compile. It's like a fairly new code base, it's written fairly clean. It doesn't have all of this legacy baggage that C has, which bogs down its compile speed. So you can compile quite a huge D program in something like 2 seconds. Almost all of the time is spent linking. It's good. Performance-wise, it's comparable to C++. You can quite easily beat C++ with a little effort because the type system is so much richer. The optimizer has so much more information to draw from, so the optimization can actually do stuff that C couldn't do. But by default, it's probably a fraction slower because of all the extra safety checks and things that go in there. There's all compiler options to say, don't compile bounds checks and don't compile this and that, which you might use if you're targeting lightning fast stuff, or you might use them in debug and then compile release without all of the runtime safety checks. And obviously if you use the garbage collector, then you're in for fun with performance, but you don't have to. Importantly, there is comprehensive C and C++ compatibility. So it has full binary linkage with other native code because it is native code. So there's no D world. D is just a language that you can use to target the native world. There is, of course, an abundance of existing investment. Your company probably has tons of legacy C code that you don't want to throw away and you don't really feel like porting. So you still have that. There's also a million C libraries out there, basically everything. So that's good. You can also compile code that is readily usable by C front-end code. So you can just tag extern C, also extern com in your D code, and it will mangle the name so that C will link to it cleanly without any problem. So you can sort of have C and D in the same project without any trouble. I've done that a lot. It's a nice way to migrate to a new language without compromising your existing workflow and all the work that you've done. So you can sort of slowly erode your environment with D code at your leisure. And yes, D has a slightly different class model than C++, but it can express the C++ class model too, so that's good. I think this one's important too. MSVC linkage. So many projects require Visual Studio compatibility. Windows, Xbox are the ones that get me. Microsoft insists you use the Visual Studio environment to build Xbox code. I have run D code on an Xbox One. Linked against the Visual Studio libraries, Microsoft's libraries. That's nice. LLVM is making a big push towards full Microsoft Visual Studio compatibility as well. So Clang is almost fully Visual Studio compatible, and as soon as it is, then D will be as well. LDC is sort of very similar to Clang. D has been used in at least one commercial video game. This one.
Is that one you worked on?
Yes, it is. I've got a whole nother talk that I did about that, actually. So if you go on YouTube and look up my name, you'll find another lecture about what I did in this project with D. And that was interesting. I used D as an extension language. D was it was kind of a risk. This is a AAA game studio. Remedy make Alan Wake, and before that, Max Payne and Death Row. These are big titles, and it took a lot of convincing to have them even try out D. But at this particular time, we were looking for like a scripting environment. We were thinking about plugging Lua in or something like this, as most game studios do. But we didn't want just a scripting language for our designers. We actually wanted a sort of that plugin environment that the tech engineers could use as well. We wanted to write like some little plug-in special case rendering effects and things like that, which Lua is just not really great for. We investigated mono and stuff like that. It was just such a big bloaty nightmare. And again, why integrate a massive sandbox just for the sake of using another totally disconnected language? It was just, I don't know, I couldn't sort of make it work in my head. What we ended up doing was inventing a little system where it would load DLLs at runtime, and it could also dynamically unload and reload DLLs at runtime. So you can sort of edit your D code while the game is live, click the compile button, it would produce a DLL, it would unload the existing one, reload the new one. D made it very, very easy to do that and sort of keep your object's state alive because of its reflection. So it was very easy, once you can reflect all of your objects, to just sort of spit them out into a little text format, unload the DLL, load the new DLL in, and then reserialize from the code using, nice reflection, and you've got sort of your runtime working state was preserved across a code rebuild cycle. So you kind of get that real-time editing like you get from Lua or something, but in a completely native environment. I think Unreal have something quite similar, but they use C++, and IdTech did something similar using flat C, or a sort of a subset of C. That worked out well for us, and there is code running on the Xbox One. That was good. So, yep, D loves you, and it deserves your love too. I hope I've got a couple of minutes. What things interested people at all, if any, and I'll substantiate.
Did you repurpose that dynamically loaded link library part of the D thing that you used to get the scripting-like effect?
Mm.
I mean, you said it was quite easy to do. Have you taken that bit out? I mean, how many lines of code was it?
There was a few. The only reason I didn't put it on the net is because it was like Remedy's a proprietary video game studio, and video game studios have a tendency not to share their code that way. I've been intending to re-implement that as an open source lib.
Yeah, if it's quite easy, that wouldn't take too long.
Yeah, I just haven't.
Right.
But you could if you wanted to.
If I could have that block of code, that would have done.
Well, Remedy owns it, and I don't work there anymore, so I'm not going to get at that anymore, sadly. But it's possible to write. Like, it wasn't hard.
Quite easy if you know D and if you know C. All these sort of caveats.
It definitely took my knowledge of D into about as deep as it gets. You know, I had to get very, very meta on that one, you know, to do it in a comprehensive way that really worked. You know, when you've got classes with like dynamic links to all these other classes, once you've got like runtime relationships being expressed, and then you start worrying about circular references and serializing all that information it got complicated, but it was possible to do. And I'm surprised because you just couldn't even try to do that in C. It just wouldn't be practical.
It's like one key word and JavaScript like require or import in Python. And your modules in there.
Well, it's native, so it's kind of more difficult to do, but it can be done. At the end of it, it became pretty easy. You know, all I did was set it up with attributes. So you just use like @serialize this or @transient that, and then, you know, some values won't be serialized because they're declared transient.
It would make it good hard for like a web server type system if there was a decent sized package module repo, like package repository. Does that exist?
Yeah, D has. There's a tool called Dub, which is sort of like a D package manager. You know, there's a lot of languages seem to develop their own little package ecosystem. So there is one for D. It's called Dub. You can find a huge repository of community packages.
When you say huge, what's the module count at the moment?
In the hundreds, but not in the thousands.
Because Maven's up at around 90,000.
Yeah, but like
90,000 as well.
most people haven't heard of D and don't use it. But I think that it's interesting language. I think it's almost ready. I think the reason that it hasn't really exploded before is because it's been cooking. There was like D1 was a sort of a much more conservative goal, and it was good, but it wasn't as ambitious as it could have been. So then at some point they went really ambitious with the foundation. Added all these new really super modern features and a couple of quite novel features. And it was baking for a while. The compiler was pretty flaky for quite a while. When I first got involved, you know, the compiler would have, you know, internal compiler errors all over the place, but nowadays you don't really see them. It's pretty much reaching maturity. It's getting to that point. Like I wouldn't have promoted it at Remedy if I didn't feel it was it was really reaching that point. And Remedy was sort of pushing the bar, you know. We were a bit nervous, and this DLL system that I was describing, you couldn't like take out the D and plug in C because, you know, once you've built it with a native language, you can do that, right? So we kind of hedged our bets a bit, but it worked out quite nicely, and it's only getting better for the environment. There's people doing like REPL type stuff, you know, that sort of type some code and watch it run thing. There's a lot of people doing web services, like you said. There's a web service framework, so you can sort of, I've done a few D web services. It's really nice, really easy. You just has all the serialization stuff that you expect.
What about asynchronous stuff, coroutines, futures, stuff to make?
Yeah, the threading stuff's got coroutines. I don't know what futures is.
Yeah, it's to try and make asynchronous code look synchronous in style.
Oh, well, that's sort of what coroutines are for, right? I've used coroutines for that.
The back end to a futures syntax can be a state machine or a thread.
Yeah, okay.
In code it looks sequential.
It looks sequential. Okay, well, coroutines exist. Right now I use them. I presume you could write a lib to do other fancy things as well. Like the tools are there. the type system knows about things like thread locality is important. So, you know, if you've got some values, it sort of knows how to TLS stuff, and it's got keywords for shared and stuff like that to say this is explicitly shared and should be locked when you're transferring. And like there's a lot of stuff in the language for threading, and how you express threading is sort of up to you. So I can say that.
Anyone porting reactive extensions to D?
I don't know.
Have you heard of that?
No, I haven't.
It's a pretty cool library. It's
Well-
been ported to a lot of languages.
Well, I don't know, but you could ask.
I just thought of it because it's for async programming.
People are interested in that because it's something that D professes to be good at, but it's also an area that not many people have really tested. So D sort of made an effort to be good at threading, but I haven't seen too many projects that make a focus on it. So getting involved and being a part of the direction for that would be good. So I think D's community is fairly small. It's growing quite quickly. In the few years that I've been watching, it's grown heaps. There's now annual D conferences in San Francisco, which I've been to speak at because...
Does Microsoft have any interest in it?
No. But Microsoft weren't opposed to it. Microsoft were, like, when I approached Microsoft and said, I want to use a different compiler to compile code and run it on your machine, I was expecting them to just go, nah. But they were surprisingly accommodating. They fully went there. They said, no, we don't really care. If it links, it links. You know, you got to use our libraries. You got to use our runtime. So we did, but that was fine. No problem there. We needed to make a couple of ABI corrections. So the reference compiler implemented Visual Studio ABI idiosyncrasies. Yeah, that. But yeah, it got there, so that's good. Other platforms aren't too bad. You know, the support for things like ARM and PowerPC and stuff is handled by GCC and LLVM, and that works straight up. So raw support for those platforms exist. Comprehensive support for those platforms, which includes sort of deep support by the runtime, is kind of still baking. So the trouble points are always TLS, the thread local store stuff. Making that portable can be fiddly because some platforms have better support for TLS than others. The garbage collector needs to be implemented well for different architectures and different platforms.
Initialize the syntax. I mean, initialize the syntax combined with reflection can make great config stuff instead of using Lua or JavaScript or JSON or whatever.
You can, well, in D you can, so you can author decode in decode and then compile it. So there's this thing called mixin, right, where you can sort of take a string, a text string of decode, and then say compile and execute that here. And a lot of people use that to do domain-specific languages of all kinds. So you can actually sort of hard code or compile time reinterpret any sort of DSL. So you can create a nice config file in whatever nice structure you like, and then physically compile it into the exe using some magic little reinterpreter, a little parser in there or something. Using D itself for config files, I don't think is there's a little bit of baggage, like you need to put a module, and you need to give modules a name at the top, and then I think, you know, the squiggly brace syntax is a bit overkill for config definitions, if you ask me. But it's nice that you can pull any text file in as a string and then totally parse it and process it and then produce code. You were saying?
That sounds good.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Before, I was just going to say one thing that would worry me about it, and I think I've said this to you before, is the gist that, you know, there's not really any big corporate sponsor like Microsoft behind it. So it feels a bit like if those two guys on the first slide were on the same plane on the way out of the D conference with a few other guys, and that plane went down, that'd be it for the language.
Well, I've had that thought, but that's not entirely true. So, well, it was nice that we sort of proved it in the AAA game space. I thought that was interesting. I did those talks.
Cool, but like that sounds like the thing you did is the biggest thing that's been done with it. Like,
No. There's a big. Facebook have made an investment in D. Facebook. Andre Alexandrescu now works at Facebook, and he's convinced Facebook themselves to make a strategic investment in D. So there's a number of Facebook projects written in D now. And I think you'll find that their contribution will help lend credibility to it. I personally like that it's not being pushed by someone like The problem with C# is that it is a Microsoft language, and then other people will shun it for that reason. The problem with NACL is that Google came up with it, and Mozilla just shun it for that reason. I'd argue that NACL's the right solution. Well,
Read it as sodium chloride.
hey?
I've always read that as sodium chloride.
Yeah, well, that's the joke.
That's the
The library is called Pepper.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So said it as knuckles before.
Well.
That's a certain aside.
Salt and pepper is what they're going for. I mean, I think it's important though. I think the interesting thing to me about D is that there's not a big special interest backing it, because to me that suggests that while it might be hard to get it, like to kick it off, assuming it does become established, and it would become established on merit alone, not because someone threw money at it, then you'd find that nobody would just be resisting it just because.
Throwing money at it, you'd hope would mean there's merit to it though, because people with lots of money throwing things at something usually want to make sure that they're not throwing.
They also want to control it.
Yeah, I don't know about this. Usually about that's right.
So think about an analogy which works the same way. Python, very popular in a lot of spaces, never had any real corporate backing. Same with Perl. But they're both just really good languages at what they do.
But by comparison, the LLVM compiler has got Apple money behind it, and there's lots of other stuff behind it too now. And that's not,
Well, that's what I mean. Like this Facebook investment, I think the Facebook investment is interesting because now there's a company sort of endorsing it, but they're not. I don't think they're responsible for the direction. And in fact, I don't think the community would really go for it, because if
Phil's about to rightly say, let's take this to the pub.
Exactly. It's a pub debate if I've ever heard
I
one.
want to say thanks to all the presenters today.